reason for modern life again. We're being recorded. So the introduction to Carte Blanche. So Carte Blanche is a French expression, and it's basically, the idea is to have a new test series that solicits recognized experts in the field to explore what they feel is actually essential to master and to understand in a given field. So with the green light of the Timing Research Forum, and thanks to Argyro Patakis, who I think is late, but she'll be joining soon, I was given the opportunity to give the first carte blanche to Randy Gallistel, whose scholarly work is pretty much foundational to cognitive neuroscience and to temporal cognition in particular. And the idea is that, of course, Timing Research Forum is a fantastic venue to provide worldwide knowledge, to share knowledge. So my question to Randy was basically, if you could have some time with a new generation of neuroscientists and cognitive scientists worldwide, what would you want to tell them? And that's basically what this lecture series is going to be about. So I'm extremely excited and honored that Randy is joining us. I'm going to leave a few words of introduction, formal introduction to Fouad Bolchi, who's one of his previous mentees.
Thank you, Virginie. I'm very excited to be here as part of this event. Obviously, Randy doesn't need an introduction, but I'll just say a few words about his background, particularly for those junior cognitive neuroscientists and behavioral neuroscientists. Randy obtained his bachelor's degree in psychology from Stanford University in 1963 and his PhD from Yale University in 1966. He joined the University of Pennsylvania in 1966, where he became a full professor in 1976. He moved to UCLA in 1989 and then to Rutgers University in 2000, where he became the co-director of the Rutgers Center for Cognitive Science. Randy is currently an emeritus professor of psychology at Rutgers University, and his honors include election to the National Academy of Science in 2002, and many fellowships in the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Society of Experimental Psychologists, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I had the opportunity to work closely with Randy as his PhD student between 2002 and 2007. And all of my empirical and theoretical research is deeply rooted in his teachings. I'm looking forward to you learning directly from his teachings as well. And Randy, thanks for accepting our invitation and taking the time to deliver these lecture series.
It's my pleasure, Fouad. So should I start?
Sure.
All right. Well, first, I want to thank Fouad and Virginie and Ben de Carte for their very important contributions to this, and also Peter Balsam. This work that I'll be describing and I hope transferring to you, that is, we've developed tools that I think can be of very broad use to the field, and that bring with these tools a kind of new way of thinking about, I think, both timing, but most particularly associative learning. In my mind, you can't really distinguish between research on timing and research on associative learning, since in my worldview, associative learning supervenes on timing. Anyway, years ago, when Don Gibbon, with whom both Peter Balsam and I had collaborated, died, Peter Balsam took over his lab, and Peter invited me to sort of join him and work with him and people, and I'm profoundly grateful to that invitation. I think both Peter and I have been have thoroughly enjoyed that collaboration and the many fruits that have emerged from it. And the things I'm going to be talking about have emerged from that. So let me bring up the lecture and get right into it.
Please, could you all turn off your microphones?
One of the challenges in this lecture series that I face is that I know I have quite a diverse audience. And for some of you, what a lot of what I'm going to be covering, particularly in this first lecture, your eyeballs are going to be rolling and thinking, Gallistel, you need to tell us this. But in vetting this material with a variety of students and postdocs, I discovered that there's some background stuff that if you don't know, it makes everything else pretty much incomprehensible. And that background really has to do with distributions. And so I think it's necessary to go through some of this. And one thing is that it seems to me some people don't have a full grasp of what exactly a probability distribution is. And I think the best way to think about it is, well, imagine a Excel spreadsheet and 2 columns of numbers, right? And the rows map from one column of numbers to the other column of numbers. And the first column of numbers is called the support vector. And so it's a string of numbers. You can think of it as a column of numbers. And the second column of numbers are either probabilities or probability density. And if you're unsure what a probability density is, that's one of the reasons why I thought I had to cover this, and I'll get there in a moment. That's what distributions are, right? Mathematically, they're functions, and they map from a support vector to a probability vector or a probability distribution vector. Part of the reason why people tend sometimes some people, not to know these really very elementary things is that in conventional statistics, distributions don't really play much of a role, because the frequentist approach to statistics and statistical inference is founded very strongly on the central limit theorem. And the central limit theorem says, well, look, regardless of what kind of distribution you're drawing from, the means of the samples that you get will be normally distributed, and it proceeds from there on in. So you just say, oh, well, I don't really care what the distribution I'm drawing from looks like. I think that's a scientific disaster, because knowing what the distribution looks like is tremendously informative about the phenomenon that you're dealing with. Okay, now why isn't it advancing? Okay, I'm having, oh, there we go. Okay. Now we get into something that is perhaps a little more meaty. So all the modern scientific programming languages, MATLAB, Python, R, Mathematica, and so on, have many inbuilt distribution functions. Oops. Damn it. Hang on, of which the binomial distribution function is one of them. And ordinarily, conceptually, and also in practice, one uses them in what I call the forward direction. That is, here I'm using the binomial PDF function in MATLAB, but there's an equivalent function in Excel, for example, but every other scientific programming language as well. And I'm putting in the support vector, 0 and 1 here, failure and success. And I'm putting in the two parameters of the binomial, and one is the number of draws. Now, the Bernoulli is a special case of the binomial, and it's the case where you make only one draw. And then you put in the second parameter, which is, and I decided to use 0.8. Okay, so you would almost never do this, because when you look at the output, you say, well, duh. I mean, this function maps these two inputs to 0.2 and 0.8, right? Now that's, of course, pretty obvious. If the P is 0.8, then the probability of success is going to be 0.8, and the probability of failure is going to be 0.2. But running it forward is just a preamble to a more unusual use of exactly the same function, okay? And this use is central to the Bayesian approach to parameter estimation, okay? Because this way of using this same function, running it backwards, is what gives you the likelihood or the likelihoods or the likelihood function, and they play a fundamental role in Bayesian parameter estimation. So when we run it backwards, the input vector is a list of possible values. It's a selection of possible values for P, for the parameter of the Bernoulli distribution, right? So P could be 0, could be 0.1, could be 0.6, could be 0.8, could be 1, right? So we put in this a selection of these values, and I'll explain in a moment why I stress selection, right? So now this is the input, right? The input occurs in what was previously a place where we put in a parameter. And now we put in the data as parameters of the function. And the data are, we made 10 draws. That's one part of the data. And we got 3 successes. Okay, so when you run it backwards, you treat some data as parameters of the same function, right? And now this function maps from this selection of possible values for P to their likelihoods, right? So it's telling us that, well, if you made 10 draws and got 3 successes, the value of 0.3, well, makes that outcome highly likely. Right? But of course, it's also consistent with other outcomes. It's just they're less likely given this data, right? So given this data, 0 is impossible because after all, you had some successes, right? And 0.1 would make these data considerably less likely than 0.3. And 0.8 would make, I mean, this isn't actually 0, but it's a very small number. So if the value of P were 0.8, then this outcome from 10 draws would be very unlikely. That's what the likelihood function is telling you. And I suspect there will be questions about this, and we can easily come back to this slide in the discussion. But this is really crucial. This is probably the single most important thing in the lecture. Okay, now the terminology here is, as far as I'm concerned, a disaster, but there's nothing that can be done about it. It's extremely well established. In fact, my collaborator, Peter Latham, on the paper that we've also posted, which gives an account of this work, keeps saying, why do you introduce this terminology of source and so on? It's the likelihood. And I said, yeah, Peter, but when I was learning this stuff, I don't know, 10 years ago, I was confused for months about what the hell the likelihood was. And that's because it's being used, when Peter uses it, he means that function that I was using, right? And for him, it's completely transparent that in Bayesian parameter estimation, that function is used in 2 different ways, right? The function that you choose is, first of all, based on your assumption of what the data that you're looking at come from, right? If you use Bino PDF, you assume that they come from a Bernoulli distribution, where there are only two possibilities, right? To Peter, that's just totally obvious. He's understood that since he was in kindergarten, I think. And then he understands that, well, yeah, and then you can use that same function to reason backwards, right? So since it's the same function, he thinks you should just call it the likelihood. And I think that's a disaster. But it doesn't really matter in the end, as long as people end up understanding, right? You can call it the source distribution, and people, mathematical whizzes like Peter will frown, or you can call it the likelihood, as long as you understand what's going on. And to me, in mathematics, a function is defined by what it maps from to. And when you use it backwards, it's mapping from a different kind of input to a different kind of output. So it seems to me a little crazy to call it the same thing as when it's mapping forward. Anyway, that brings us to Bayes' rule. Now, I know many of you understand this, but I also know that many who sort of understand it are a little shaky when it comes to the form in which it's most often used in real work, which is when you replace the individual probabilities with functions, right? So this is Bayes' rule, as most working Bayesians use it, right? And it relates two distribution functions. Here's the prior function. Here's the likelihood function to another function, which is the posterior distribution. And notice that this is not an equality here. This is the proportion sign, right? In other words, in the form in which it's usually done by people who are mathematically careful, it says this isn't an equality. It just says this function is proportional to the product of these two functions. Okay. Now, notice that the M here, right? The M stands in for whatever your assumption is about the source distribution, right? It's what is your model for the data? Do you think the data are coming from an exponential distribution or a normal distribution and so on? Because that's the function that you're going to use in these calculations, right? The theta is the parameter vector of that distribution. Right? So if you make a different assumption about the model, then you'll have a different theta. Right? And it's called the parameter vector because different models can have different numbers of parameters. The Bernoulli only has the one parameter, p, right? And the exponential, which we'll be coming to, only has lambda, the rate parameter, or its inverse, its reciprocal, the mean of the distribution, right? But the normal distribution, of course, has two parameters. Usually, they're the mean and the sigma, or sometimes the mean and the variance. But when you're doing Bayesian work, as we will see later, not in this lecture, you use a different parameterization, the mean and the precision, which is the 1 over the variance. Okay, so notice that the theta appears in all three of these. Each of these is a function, right? And theta appears in each of them. And that's because if you were making a graph, all of the theta is the x-axis for every one of these functions, right? It's the support for each one of these functions. And what Bayes' rule says is, okay, you have a prior distribution function, which is a function of the parameters of your model for the data. It's not a function of the possible values of the data. It's a function of the parameters for your model of the data, right? And then you have a function which is the based on your model, which is also a function of the data, and which I'll be coming to in a moment. But this is your model run backwards. Okay, so when you're computing this, what you actually feed in to the function from your scientific programming language are possible values for theta. So you saw this already in the example I gave. I fed it, when I was running it backwards, I fed in possible values for p, right? If my model is the exponential, then I would feed in possible values for the rate parameter. If my model is the normal distribution, then I would feed in possible values for the mean and the precision of a normal distribution. Okay, so because these two functions are plotted, I always think visually, right? They're plotted over the same x-axis. They're two curves. You can plot them on the same panel with the same x-axis. It makes sense to multiply them, right? What does it mean to multiply them? Well, you just imagine going along the x-axis point by point, and at every point, if you look up, you get a value for one function and a value for the other function, and you just take the product of those two values, and you do that for every point on the x-axis. So in doing that, you generate another function, which is the product of these two functions. All right. Now we look over here, and this is the posterior distribution, right? And it's also a function of theta. It tells you how probable different values are for theta, given the data that you have, right? But all distributions have to integrate to 1. And the integral of this product does not, except in very unusual circumstances, the integral of this product is not 1. In fact, when you actually get down to doing this, the integral of this product is fairly obvious. It could be 200 orders of magnitude different from 1, right? I mean, it'll not only, it's not equal to 1, it's wildly different from 1, right? Okay, so that's why this is a proportion, not an equality, right? Because this has to integrate to 1 and this doesn't integrate to 1. Okay, but what does it mean to say it's a proportion? Well, what it means is you can make this, you can make this product integrate to 1 by just rescaling it. The proportion means the two things are related by a scale factor. Right? So I'm laughing because once I finally realized what was going on, this rescaling operation is kind of a joke. So you compute the integral here, and of course it's wildly different from 1. And then but then you multiply this product by 1 over whatever its integral is, which is just like scaling, changing the scale factor on the y-axis. And lo and behold, now it integrates to 1. All right, so, okay, so now it's a probability distribution, right? Because you've made it integrate to 1. And you can always do that, at least in the simple cases we're talking about. This, nothing we'll do in these whole lectures goes beyond very simple Bayesian stuff. When you get to multi-dimensional things and so on, computing that integral gets to be tricky and so on. But for what we're going to be doing, it's completely trivial. Okay. Now, we come to continuous distributions, and this is going to be important later, and they're conceptually trickier. And the reason they're conceptually trickier is that when I say, well, you can think of the support as a column of numbers, anyone who really knows their mathematics will say, yeah, Gallistel, you can. but you should bear in mind that it's an uncountably infinite column of numbers. It's not a column of numbers you're ever going to see in your Excel spreadsheet or in your MATLAB table, because there are uncountably many different possible numbers in that support vector. What uncountably infinite means, at least roughly speaking, is that if you set out to list them, you know you can't count them because it's an infinite set, but you can't even start counting them because it's impossible to arrange them in a countable order. This is a famous proof by Carte, who was founded modern set theory. And this raises conceptual problems, as we will see, particularly when we get to computing the entropies of distributions, because most of the distributions that we'll be interested in are continuous distributions. So we're constantly going to have to be taking this into account in the problems that it leads to, very practical problems. This isn't just some mathematical quibble. You need to know this sort of in your bones when you're doing the work, because you have to be careful. And we'll see that in subsequent lectures. Now, another thing about continuous distributions is that they're mapping the support not to probabilities, but to probability densities. And I know from years of teaching that I remember myself having trouble understanding what the hell a probability density was. And I know many students have problems. But first, let's just see what this means as a practical matter. Suppose I use, instead of the Bernoulli, I use MATLAB's exponential distribution function, right? EXP PDF, that's MATLAB's exponential probability density function. And again, there's the equivalent thing, I suspect, with a very similar name in all the other programming languages. Okay, so I say, well, tell me, P, what are the probabilities of 0, 0.3, 0.5, 1.2 in an exponential distribution whose rate parameter has value 0.5. You can think of it as half a second or half a minute, right? And so this is the input vector, and this function maps it to these probabilities. Now, do you see a problem with these probabilities? One of these probabilities is 2. Distributions, all of when you sum over all the probabilities, they have to equal 1. Well, Houston, we got a problem, because the probability here is already 2. So that's because these aren't probabilities. These are probability densities. All right. And probability densities can assume any value between 0 and infinity, whereas probabilities can only assume values between 0 and 1. Okay, hang on. For some reason, my PowerPoint isn't advancing. The glitch is the one. Oh, there we go. Okay, I guess I just have to click on it. So here's how I like to think about probability density. I hope this helps, right? Because if you try to say what it means in words, your tongue gets tangled. But I like to think of a probability distribution, a continuous one like the normal, right? They always have the property that they rise above the axis and then they come back down to the axis, or to the x-axis, right? So you can think of them as a pile of dirt. And imagine a bulldozer that starts at the left end of the x-axis and bulldozes that pile of dirt into a tower at the right axis, all right? So as the bulldozer moves along the axis, the dirt is piling up, right? And the probability density is the rate at which the dirt is piling up at any given point along the x-axis, all right? So it's, in technical language, it's the derivative of the cumulative probability function, because the cumulative probability function describes the pile of dirt as a function of where the bulldozer is. All right. And the cumulative probability function is always unproblematic because it always ends at 1. It starts at 0 and it rises to 1. And that's because, again, the fundamental fact about a probability distribution is that it has to sum or integrate to 1. Okay. All right. So all of that is preamble to the basic fact about parameter estimation from a Bayesian perspective, right? Because the Bayesians bring in something that you never encounter in statistics we were always taught, we've all been taught, which is a prior. And I know that out there, even among my colleagues at Rutgers, most of them were very hazy about what exactly the prior actually was in Bayesian analysis, because many of them came to me to explain it. Okay, so I've laid the foundation for this by saying, look, whatever distribution you think the data come from, that's the source distribution, and it has parameters, right? And when you're trying, and what you want to do is estimate the values of those parameters from your data. In the prior distribution is a distribution that represents your prior uncertainty about what the values of those parameters might be, okay? And it's every bit as much a distribution as the one that you think the data come from. It's generally, this isn't true, it's generally a different distribution, but it also has parameters, because all distributions have parameters. It usually, in the work we'll be doing, it always has more parameters than the source distribution. But when you're doing Bayesian parameter estimation, you're always working with two distributions, a source distribution and a prior. So if you're doing the Bernoulli is the source, the prior is the beta distribution. We'll get there in subsequent lectures. If you're working with the exponential, as you are often in timing or in response data, inner response intervals are very often approximately exponentially distributed. So you're often working with the exponential distribution. And there are different ways of parameterizing it. This will be true in general, but the Bayesian way is to use the rate, the lambda. And the prior, this isn't obligatory. You can use different priors, but for reasons we'll get to, there's definitely a preferred prior for all of these, and it's called the conjugate prior. And the conjugate prior for the exponential is the gamma distribution. And if your source is a normal distribution, then you have to parameterize it in a very unusual way. I didn't even know this way of parameterizing it existed until I became a Bayesian. So the mean, that's, of course, we're all used to that, but instead of the standard deviation, you use the precision, which is 1 over the variance. It takes some getting used to. And the prior is the normal gamma distribution, which has 4 parameters. Itself has 4 parameters. Now you can see already that since we're dealing with 2 distributions in every case, and both of them have parameters, that the opportunity for confusion about what parameters we're actually talking about is very great. And therefore, by convention, the parameters of the prior are called the hyperparameters, okay? They're just plain ordinary parameters, right? They're not hyper anything, but they're called the hyperparameters just to make sure you don't confuse them with the parameters of the source distribution. Okay, so let me show you Bayesian parameter estimation. I think the half hour is up, right, Virginie? When did we start?
It has been 35 minutes, but the first few minutes were introductions. So I would just say it has been half an hour, basically. Yeah.
Well, let me quickly try to show people this thing by because the reason I'm keen to show people this is that where I'm heading with all this is that we should forget about what they're propagandizing you in the journals because of the replication crisis, where you have to specify your sample size in advance and you have to even say exactly what tests you're going to run on that sample. You know, this is crazy. Before you know what the hell the results look like, you're supposed to. So the Bayesian leads to a completely different approach. It says, no. You should make an assumption about the product. You can even make two different assumptions about what the distribution they're coming from might actually look like. Could be exponential, it could be normal. And you can run the parameter estimation simultaneously on both of them and see which is doing a better job of representing your data as your data come in. Right? And if you've got a big effect, as we'll see, there's a way of measuring the significance that will tell you this as soon as you have enough data to show it. Right? So you don't waste your time running a bunch of extra subjects that you didn't have to run because it was significant at the 0.0001 level after the seventh subject, right? Whatever. So that's where we're headed. And I just want to show you this to give you a feel for. So let's hope this.
Randy, would it be possible for you to maximize the command window by any chance? Because it seems a bit small.
But Fuad, I didn't understand what you said.
Is it possible for you to maximize the MATLAB command window? Because the text seems very small.
Yeah, it's possible, but I know in principle it's possible to do. It doesn't matter because I'm going to be showing you a graph and I made that very large. I mean, this command is this is just a custom function, which I have uploaded to the GitHub. Now, no, I haven't. I'm sorry. I've sent it to Ben, who will upload it to the GitHub, right? And he will also make a Python version of it, right? But this is just the function that has both the it calls one of our custom updating functions, but it produces the graphic, and that's all you need to know. It's the graph that's relevant. Okay, so if I hit. Yeah, good. Okay, so now that should be pretty clearly visible, I hope. Right? Okay, so we're assuming these data come from an exponential distribution. We've used MATLAB's, all the programming languages allow you to draw simulated or artificial data from these distributions. So we've drawn 50 we've made 50 draws from an exponential distribution with a mean of 10. You can think of it as some timing distribution or inner response interval, and the distribution we've drawn from has a mean inner response interval of 10 seconds. So the rate parameter is 1/10, that's 0.1, right? And this is the situation after the first draw. So at this point, we have one datum, right? And up here, because I'm going to show it's rapidly going to appear within this thing. But of course, when you only have one datum, your posterior distribution is very spread out, and it may have a very high peak and so on. So if I adjusted the X limb and Y limb, you would see the complete curve here, but already you can say, okay, whoa, it's all over the place, right? Because of course, when you only have one datum, you have a lot of uncertainty about what the true value actually is. A point of enormous importance, however, is that yes, you have a lot of uncertainty, but you don't have infinite uncertainty. One datum actually tells you a lot. In fact, there's a theorem, due to Fisher. The first datum tells you way more than all the subsequent data, right? Basically, the first datum tells you the ballpark, right? Before the first datum, at least in principle, you have no clue what the ballpark is. And after you've seen the first datum, you know what the ballpark is. And this posterior quantifies the ballpark. It tells you, given that one datum, what kind of uncertainty you have about the true value of the distribution, of the parameter of the distribution from which that one datum came. And here's the dotted line, the dashed line here is the truth, right? That this is 0.1, and we know that's the truth. And notice that this does include the truth. And because you can download this function once Ben has uploaded it, you can run this over and over again with many data sets. And you'll see that this thing almost always includes the truth, right? And moreover, it says, well, it includes the truth. And it says, and it tells you if you move out far enough that, look, there are values here that are extremely unlikely. So you already know then where the likelihood lies and where it doesn't lie, even though you only have one datum. And that's going to be enormously important as we go along. So here's the estimate. If you use this posterior distribution, the mean of this posterior distribution, it says, okay, here's given the one datum, the estimate of the exponential distribution from which we're drawing. And it's very inaccurate. This, as you're going to see, this is not really a good, but still, it's better than nothing, way better than nothing. Okay, so now if this works, I just keep hitting, hang on, let me move this out of the way. And I keep hitting a key. Yeah, okay, here's after two data, right? By the way, this is the formula for the distribution, for the gamma distribution that we're plotting. This is GAM PDF in MATLAB. And the input to it are possible values for lambda, right? And I produced those. It's a vector in 0.01 steps going from 0 to 1. Now, obviously, I had some prior knowledge about what the support for this would plausibly be. And again, with only two data, you see that this support does not, it's missing. One really wants to see what it looks like out here as well at this point. But you see already that it's sharpening up and we only have two data. And if we click again, we have three data. Wow, not bad. I mean, we only have three data. And this won't always be the case, right? If you run this repeatedly, this function won't, at the moment, as you're going to see, after only three data, we actually have a very good picture. In fact, the picture will actually get worse as you add more data because the data are very noisy, right? And that means sometimes they pull you away from the truth. But now you see we have an N of 3. And the other argument to the gamma function takes two inputs as its argument, is the cumulative duration of the intervals that we've been looking at. So this is simply the sum of the three intervals that we have so far seen, and we're recording the responses of this subject. All right? Now you're going to see that this distribution narrows rapidly for the next few. And then, and this is the law of large numbers, it's sort of in reverse. Then the law of diminishing returns. Then as you add more and more data, it actually narrows very slowly. And that's because most of the information is actually in the first few data. So now let's start adding data. Okay, there's after n equals 4, n equals 5. Notice it got worse. The peak of the distribution is actually moved away from the truth, right? N equals, 6. It's moving back again. N equals 7, n equals 8. Okay, so here's a traditional sample size. many of us have a kind of feel that n's a pretty good sample size, and we're right. Adding more data, yes, it'll narrow our uncertainty, but only very slowly, as you're now going to see, right? And sometimes this situation will get worse for a while. Okay, so here's 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. It's getting narrower, but very slowly. 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, no, 31, 32, 33, 34, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40. Okay, we're getting up to our total sample, which is 50. Okay, there we are. So this is the posterior distribution, right? And it tells you how uncertain we are about what the true value of lambda down here is, right? And the maximum likelihood estimate of lambda is simply the value of lambda at the peak of this distribution, right? And Bayesians like to use the mean of this posterior rather than the maximum likelihood for the, when it always becomes symmetric like this as you have more data. And as you can see, 50 is a lot of data. It's very symmetric, right? And when it's symmetric, it doesn't matter whether you use the mean or the maximum likelihood because they're the same. I mean, within tiny amounts. As you saw, when you only have a couple of data, then it's unsymmetric, asymmetric. And it does matter whether you use the peak, the maximum likelihood, or the mean. And this is the expression for the exponential distribution, right? Lambda is its parameter, right? It's in function of, I'm plotting it here as a function of the duration. And okay, that's it. Let's discuss it.
Thanks, Randy. I think there was a question already in the chat.
Good, I hope.
Gabrielle Sutton, maybe that person wants to ask live the question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was a specific reason to use a regular gamma with precision instead of an inverse gamma to model variance directly for a prior.
On the normal distribution, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. The answer I'm going to give is embarrassing. First of all, it's not clear that that's a terrific question, or at least it's a question I've asked myself many times. And to be honest, I'm not very clear about why they do it, because you can do it the other way. And actually that leads to an important point, which will come up in future lectures. The source distributions always, even the Bernoulli, has more than one way of parameterizing it. And when you get down to practical, the way you choose to parameterize it determines what functions you actually use. So if you parameterize the normal in a much more conventional way by the mean and the variance, then as your question shows, and as you clearly know, you wouldn't use the normal gamma as you'd use the inverse, you'd use the inverse, normal inverse gamma or something. And that function exists. You can find it on Wikipedia. And you can use it, particularly if you use the Jeffreys prior, because the Jeffreys prior, which we'll come to, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but the Jeffreys prior has the unique property that it doesn't matter how you parameterize the source. You'll get the same answer, even if you choose to parameterize it in terms of the variance and the mean rather than the mean and the precision. provided, of course, you have to change the prior, but you use the change of what's called the change of variable formula in order to convert the prior, convert from one prior to another. Provided that you do that, you will, your estimates will be the same. If you parameterize it in the other way, you will get an estimate of the mean rather than an estimate of the, no, I'm sorry, you'll get an estimate of the mean in both cases, but you'll get an estimate of the variance rather than the precision. But of course, you have to bear in mind that precision is just 1 over the variance, right? So you can always switch from one to the other. Now, in MATLAB, I've often thought about about doing it the other way, but I would have to use the change of variable formula to take MATLAB's, no, hang on. I haven't done it basically out of laziness, because it was hard to find the actual computational formula for the normal gamma. And in fact, Dave Freestone basically helped me program that in MATLAB, which was a little tricky. And that's part of the reason why we're uploading all of this stuff to GitHub, to save the rest of you that kind of problem. So I've got the normal gamma function programmed in MATLAB. MATLAB doesn't make it available to you as one of the built-in functions. Maybe Python does, what do I know?
Well, if you ever find yourself partial to R, there are packages that'll give you inverse gamma.
Yes, I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are. And you can use the inverse gamma and the Jeffreys prior, and there's no reason not to. In general, in basic, for reasons I don't understand, I mean, your question is, why do they do that? And to be honest, as it's clear from my jumble of an answer, I don't really know. But I have a hunch there's some derivation is easier or something. There's some mathematical reason, but I don't know what it is.
The reason that I ask is because I'm in a Bayesian class right now, and our professor prefers using inverse gamma. So I didn't realize it was a more.
Oh, well, good for him. Actually, if he uses MATLAB, I'd love to have the his code. Yeah, it's and we've stumbled on an important truth here. I mean, this is particularly the case for the normal, and it's particularly relevant there because the precision is, working with the precision is confusing, at least for me and at first. And so I would actually prefer to work with the variance. But the same is true for the Bernoulli. Let's talk about the Bernoulli for a moment. I mean, normally we say, well, you parameterize the Bernoulli with the P, right? That's what God told us. But, the bookies, they don't think about it that way. Well, of course, they're only working with the Bernoulli in a 2-horse race. And more generally, they're working with the binomial. But let's take the 2-horse race or the odds quoted on a soccer game, right? So that's a Bernoulli. And of course, bettors work with the odds. That's P over 1 minus P, all right? And there's nothing wrong with the odds. In fact, I think bookies do it because they're more intuitive. And so do I. I actually prefer quoting the odds rather than the P. But so you can run the Bayesian calculation with the Bernoulli, parameterized by the odds, all right? Provided that you change the prior from beta to whatever. I don't know what prior you use, but you can actually use the beta and just the change of variable formula to change the input to the beta. Anyway, it's an important practical issue, and I'm glad you asked the question.
If there are any other questions, you can either speak or just write it in the chat box. And
hard for me to believe there aren't questions about continuous distributions. At least from years of teaching, I know that many people find it confusing, or the cumulative distribution versus the one we're more familiar with. Mathematically, most mathematicians prefer the cumulative distribution. Partly because it's sort of easier to understand, right? It's a probability. But also, well, I won't go there.
I think this is a great opportunity for especially junior scientists to understand why they are using certain distributions in their research, say even in their experiments. When you determine the trial interval, for instance, according to an exponential distribution, there's a logic behind that.
Yes.
We don't pick these distributions just because somebody else did. These different distributions provide us with different opportunities in terms of research. If you want to, for instance, prevent any temporal expectancy, sure, we will pick exponential distributions. So I think it's a great opportunity for people to figure out why different kinds of distributions are used for different use cases.
Yeah, but I totally agree. And in fact, more will be said about that in subsequent lectures. So, because it turns, the exponential in particular plays, first of all, as I've already mentioned, interresponse intervals are usually, at least in all the data I've seen, and I've seen a lot, approximately exponentially distributed, both in Pavlovian and in operant protocols. So the exponential, I mean, one point, the trouble with conventional statistics is because of the central limit theorem and so on, it doesn't encourage people to actually look at what their data look like, what the distribution actually is. And I have encountered any number of absolutely scandalous errors as a consequence of that. I know experimental traditions where the data are typically bimodal, and many of the people working with those data don't even know that. And they're computing the mean. And they're dropping the data into a standard ANOVA program and so on, right? Now, of course, many of you, I'm sure, know where I'm headed here, but my colleague, John McCann, gave me a relative memorable illustration about why computing the mean can be problematic. He pointed out that the mean human being has one breast and one testicle. So that's true. But very, very few actual human beings have one breast and one testicle, right? So the mean is intended to be representative, right? And when you have a spectacularly bimodal distribution, right, it can be very far. The mean, you can have no data anywhere near the mean, right? So one of the great advantages of the Bayesian approach, as far as I'm concerned, is that it requires you to, if you're going to assume a distribution, you have to say, well, why am I assuming this? And if you have some actual data, every one of the scientific programming languages has a function that computes the empirical cumulative distribution. And if you don't, that's the first thing I ever do with every data set I ever get. And I get lots of different data sets because I collaborate with several different labs. But as soon as I get a data set, first thing I do is to throw the data into the cumulative distribution to see what the distribution actually looks like. Is it exponential? Is it normal? Does it look like a Weibull? Is it bimodal? Are there extreme outliers? And
there is a Peter, you might want to intervene. There's a comment in the chat about this, but I don't know if Peter Claessens wants to speak up rather than just put in the chat.
Yeah. Was that a question? I'm not sure I fully understood you.
Yes, no, there's a comment in the chat by Peter Claessens that could be interesting to bring up, but I don't know if he can.
Well, there's a bit of noise here, but I'll try. We often choose priors for opportunistic reasons, basically. For example, because they are conjugate.
Yes.
But we don't know if they are in any ways similar to what maybe subjects using experiments or in real life. So how strong is this argument to choose one or another prior if we really don't know? The question is, does it really make a difference, of course?
So again, I'm very glad you asked that question. And also, we will revisit this question, but that's good because all of these things help if you think about them more than once. So there are two aspects to your question. The first one is what I was just discussing, is what does the source distribution actually look like, right? So you're saying we make an assumption. Well, if we have data, we don't, it's not an assumption. When you put it into the cumulative empirical distribution and look at it, you know a lot about what is a realistic assumption about those data, right? I was just running through what you learned just by glancing at the cumulative distribution, right? If it's symmetrical and looks like an S, you say, oh, well, these data are roughly normal. Okay, so you're no longer assuming that. You can see that it's true. If it's a quite asymmetrical S, with the psychophysical data, it's very commonly that has a long rightward tail. You say, well, these data could be better described by the Weibull distribution, right? If it's exponential, right? Again, all of these have a kind of signature appearance. What you'll often see very often, almost all data sets have outliers, at least I work with. So you'll see it, you know, it looks pretty good for the first 90% of data, but then you got some data, you know, 2 orders of magnitude out to the right. All of that, I mean, you immediately learn things that are going to be fundamental to what you then do, whether you're going to do Bayesian or anything, right? If you've got those outliers there, you're going to have to think twice before you compute a mean, right? Probably better to use the median, right? Because those outliers are going to completely screw up the mean. They're going to dominate the mean. They're going to put the mean out where there are practically no data, right? You don't want to do that. They also tell you what kind of ordinary test you might use. Forget the Bayesian for a moment. I much prefer the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test to the t-test because the Kolmogorov-Smirnov is basically invulnerable to outliers. It isn't affected, whereas the ANOVA and the t-test are hugely affected by the outliers. And a lovely thing about the KS test is that they're also often missing data, right? You know, subject didn't respond on some number of trials or whatnot. And as long as the missing data aren't more than as long as there aren't too much of them. Again, the Kolmogorov-Smirnov will, you can compute it even though they're missing data. Whereas if you're going to do the t-test, you have to worry about, okay, what do we do about the missing data? And there are things you can do about the missing data by the KS test is much easier. And that's just as good as the t-test. So you shouldn't be assuming what your data look like. You should have looked at the data and know. Okay, now your question is, well, but you also make an assumption about your prior. And you're absolutely right that the default assumption is that it be the conjugate prior. Now, I'm very much we're getting ahead of the story. Another lecture will be devoted very much to this sort of thing, but there are powerful reasons for using the conjugate prior. So to my mind, the question is, why would you not? That is, there are reasons. I can imagine situations where you wouldn't, but if you use the conjugate prior, I think a knowledgeable person would never question you're using it. And if you don't use it, then there should be some strongish reason why you wouldn't use it. Why do you don't? So first of all, they're just practical reasons. As we'll see, I mean, this is all about the advantages of updating your estimates datum by datum. And when you use the conjugate prior, this is totally straightforward because you assume, say, the beta distribution as a prior on the Bernoulli. Once you've updated it, it's still the beta distribution. And that means that the only thing that has changed when you updated it are the parameters of that distribution. And there are laughably trivial update formulae for those parameters. So first of all, the computation is very simple. And it doesn't involve multiplying the prior times the likelihood and integrating and all that stuff. It's third grade arithmetic to upgrade the hyperparameters, right? So those are strong practical reasons. If you use any distribution other than the conjugate distribution, so suppose I said, no, I'm pretty sure the p-value lies near the middle, and I'm going to use the normal distribution centered near the middle. You can do that. I mean, it's a little crazy because the beta, you can choose your hyperparameters so that it looks just like the normal centered near the middle, but you could use the normal if you want. But now, as soon as first of all, to update it, you'll have to compute the likelihood function, multiply it times your prior distribution, and then get the integral. And you're going to have to do this numerically because there are no closed form functions. That is, as soon as when you've multiplied the likelihood times the prior, you'll have a function, but there's no name for it. There's no closed form expression for it. It's not built into your scientific programming thing. You're going to have to proceed numerically in integrating it. And you can do all these things. It's not as if, but once you've done them a few times, it's a bit tricky. You have to choose, when you do it numerically, you have to choose your bin widths, and it's a nuisance. So when you've done that a few times, you say, why would I do this? So there has to be some motivation, some advantage, or some compelling reason for using a non-conjugate prior. And so far, in my experience, I can't recall a case in which I thought I had a good reason not to use the conjugate prior. So have you encountered cases in which that didn't seem right?
Tony.
Hello?
My dog. The question is maybe there's a bit difference here between what a prior is supposed to do when you're analyzing data and what it's supposed to do in a model of a cognitive process. So in the sense,
yeah.
when you mention either computational or analytical convenience, that sounds for me still like an opportunistic matter. If the question is about does the brain use an inverse gamma distribution because it's convenient? That's what I was trying to argue about.
Okay, I hear you. You're of course right that when it comes to choose, so priors of course also figure in Bayesian models, right? Now, I want to stress that actually later on when I come to associative learning, I'll be both showing you how to analyze the data and suggesting that indeed this is exactly what the brain is doing, right? So I'll be muddying the waters between simple parameter estimation and modeling what the brain is doing. And I want to stress that those who think that it's unimaginable that the brain is doing the inverse gamma, they just ignore all the modeling suggestions and just say, okay, but it's great for parameter estimation, and the parameter estimation is, in some sense, has to precede theory, right? So that is, the choice of a prior when you're building a model is indeed a different game because, you know, what data are you going to look at? You can't look inside the, usually you don't know. So you're free to make it up. And so, yeah, then it's quite unconstrained and you might have some modeling goal in mind that would cause you to use some particular prior. And, you know, when you're modeling, you're free to make any assumptions you want, as long as at some point you actually stack them up against the data, which in my jaundiced opinion is quite rare in modern neuroscience modeling. Many papers begin with a kind of cartoon description of what they think the data look like, which is often very far from what they actually look like. And then they proceed to propound their model and say that it gives cartoon answers to cartoon data and so on. But but when you're modeling, you make whatever assumptions you like. And your question brings out an important point, is that you can use whatever prior you like. Be my guest. Particularly when you're modeling. Even in the modeling, of course, you're going to have to do computations. And I like models that have closed form solutions. And if you want closed form solutions, then you're generally going to have to go with the conjugate priors.
I would propose, there's still one more question, but I would propose to keep with time because a lot of people have to go now. Randy, if it's okay with you, and then to keep the questions for next session, sure, which will be a hands-on session. And it was my understanding that you wanted to have eventually some students or researchers actually come with their own distributions. Would be
yes, for sure. Yes, there's nothing like seeing it put to work on your own data to, yes, that would be terrific.
Do come with your data and with the code from MATLAB or Python or your favorite language for next week.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah, again, I thank Ben de Carte for translating it into Python, and I do hope people download things. I mean, understanding really comes with use. And so if you don't use these tools, and then also questions come from use, right? You download, you do something and something doesn't work or doesn't make sense. Here's your opportunity in subsequent lectures to say, hey, what's going on here? This didn't work. And that will be very instructive, not just for you, but for other people. So yeah, please do.
Thank you so much, and see you next week, same time.
2 weeks, right? Is it next week or?
It is next week, if I'm not mistaken.
Hang on, let me look at my calendar.
Let's verify. Yeah, now I'm confused as well.
Oh, you're right. Yes, the second lecture is next week. Thank you.
It's next week, right? So we are talking.
I've got it right in my calendar. It's not my memory.
Okay, we'll have a reminder email anyway. Many thanks, everyone, and see you soon.
Yeah.
See you.